And it is now my honor to introduce our final speaker of the day, a 2024 Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's director of the Pearson Institute and co-author of 3 books, including the international bestseller, Why Nations Fail, co-authored with fellow Nobel laureate and foreign guest last year, Daron Acemoglu. So please join me in welcoming Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, James Robinson.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's very exciting to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, power and prosperity, rethinking governance, and I'm going to talk about economic growth and what causes economic growth, and a little bit about the future of economic growth, at least in some part of the world that I know well. So maybe I have to press this, do I? No, not quite sure if it's under... Oh, yes, there we go. Okay, so, all right. So let me talk about economic growth, and I'm going to talk about an example I know a lot about that I've been researching for the last few years, which I think is a sort of exemplar of what we know creates economic growth and what the recipe for economic growth and prosperity is, which is South Korea. This is just a picture of relative prosperity in some parts of the world over the last 60, 70 years. We see the United States at the top there. We see the rise of China starting in the 1980s, starting after 1978 with the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. But what I want to emphasize here is I want to emphasize the making of a Korean economic miracle, which is the dramatic transformation of South Korea, which, if I went back to the 1950s or 1960s, was a desperately poor country. In 1970, the main exports of South Korea were plywood, apparel, and human hair. 10% of exports in 1970 was human hair for wigs from South Korea. But then South Korea organized this dramatic transformation to such an extent that now income per capita overtook Japan. So we could argue about the numbers, depends on how you compare prices and things like that. But no one's doubting the incredible transformation of South Korea. So how would I think about that? And I think when an economist thinks about a picture like that, they actually start with the work of a previous Nobel laureate, which is Robert Solow. And Robert got the Nobel Prize for his work in the 1950s, sort of decomposing the origins of economic growth or the sources of economic growth. And what he showed is that what really drives economic growth is innovation. It's technical change. I also, I think about my own country, England. We think about the British Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century and the early 19th century as ushering in this period of sustained economic prosperity in the world. What was the Industrial Revolution about? It was about innovation. It was about the invention of the steam engine, new methods of transportation. It was about the factory system, the mechanization of cotton weaving and spinning. It was taking production techniques and getting machines to do them. Okay? It was all about innovation. Okay? What Robert showed, that's the big picture. So lying behind that picture of economic growth, or lying behind that picture of sort of transformation in a country like South Korea, is a process of innovation, of the adoption and creation of new technologies. So how would an economist sort of look at that? Well, if we were thinking about innovation, we could think about the sort of the inputs, or we could think about the outputs. So by inputs, you could sort of say, well, there's different inputs into innovation. We could look at the amount of resources that went into innovation. We could look at the number of people who specialized in doing innovation. So, there's lots of ways you could come at this, but if I just looked at the number of people who specialized in research and development in South Korea, you see this is relative to the size of the population, of course. So more people absolutely in China or the United States are doing research and development, but just to get a sense of how important this is relative to the size of the economy, normalizing by population, you see this rapid investment in research and development in South Korea. So resources were allocated to innovation. This is the sort of the inputs. What about the outputs, you could say? Well, how would an economist measure the output of innovation? I sort of said, you could say prosperity was the ultimate output, but what about patenting? So one way that economists have measured innovation is just looking at patents. So patents, I'm going to talk about patents a little bit more when I talk more about, so if Robert Solow said this, what did you get the Nobel Prize for? So I'm coming to that, but patents are very important, as you all know, because patents protect intellectual property rights. You come up with an innovation, you come up with an idea that can create wealth, but it's very easy for other people to copy. So a patent protects your intellectual property rights. That creates incentives for innovation. So when you see people patenting, you see, okay, people are coming up with new ideas, they're coming up with new innovations that they think are worthy of being protected. So it's a way that economists have measured the outputs of innovation. You can see here South Korea, immensely successful. So South Korea, patents, again, normalized by the size of the population, rockets up in the 1980s and 1990s. So that economic transformation in South Korea is underpinned by this enormous upsurge in innovation, in allocation of resources to innovation, in outputs in terms of patenting. Okay, so where is all that coming from? Why is it that somehow in a place like South Korea, which was a poor country exporting wigs in 1970, suddenly all this energy went into innovation, patenting, into economic growth, entrepreneurship? And the argument in our research is that that's because of the institutions. It's because South Korea created what we call inclusive economic institutions, and that's what stimulated that explosion of innovation and economic growth. Ultimately, innovation comes from people. It comes from people's ideas, people's creativity, their dreams, their ambitions, their passions, their projects. And the way I think about economic growth is, in any society, there's a huge amount of latent talent and energy and creativity. You just have to organize a system of incentives, a system of institutions, of rules that can allow all that latent talent to get to the top. I usually illustrate that with Thomas Edison and the light bulb. If you've read our book, Why Nations Fail, you know we have this sort of iconic picture, which I sort of spared you of this, but if you look at the Korean peninsula at night, you see, South Korea is sort of blazing with light and light bulbs, and North Korea is black. And that, that shows in a very visceral way this incredible economic divergence that's taken place in the Korean peninsula over the last 70 years. And, this is Thomas Edison's patent in 1880 of the light bulb. So Edison was a sort of brilliant man. He had over 1,000 patents, very driven. He patented the light bulb. He came up with lots of different inventions. Okay? And so the patent is an example of an economic institution which creates incentives. I already sort of suggested, like, the idea of the patent is protects your intellectual property rights. It stops other people taking your ideas. That means you benefit from a greater portion of the wealth that your ideas create. That creates incentives. Okay, so it kind of brings your individual incentives in line with what's good for society. Okay, the other aspect of the patent system, which I think is sort of interesting, is that it's inclusive in a very important sense, in the sense that there's a law, there's a patent law, at least at the time when Edison was inventing, and the patent law said everyone pays the same fee, and the government protects your intellectual property rights. So the idea was to create a kind of level playing field where anyone who came up with an idea could go, file a patent, get their intellectual property rights protected. Okay? The social background of patentees is very interesting. There's a beautiful study of who were these people who filed patents in 19th century America. It's a bit more complicated nowadays because now businesses hold patents. There's less Individuals hold patents too. I think last time I checked, Bill Gates had about 400 patents in his name, but businesses also have patents. So in the 19th century, it's kind of a little simpler because patents are all at the individual level, as with the case of Edison. So an interesting question is, who are these people who patented? Who was Edison after all? Who was this guy? So Edison was homeschooled. His father was a roofing contractor. He wasn't from money. He didn't have resources. He had to actually fund his own businesses by selling off early inventions he made to raise capital. He couldn't get money from a bank. He improvised. But he was a charismatic, talented, innovative person. Okay, and that's the general picture. Like, what's fascinating is if you look at these people who took out patents, you see they come from everywhere in society. They come from all over the social spectrum. Elites, non-elites, poor people, artisans, farmers, educated, non-educated. So to my point that talent, innovation, creativity is spread everywhere in society. I mean, that's why finance is so important, because people have ideas, they have dreams, they want to start a business. They don't have resources. Where do they get the resources from? That's why the financial system is so critical. Okay? So what the patent system is an example of what we call an inclusive economic institution. It's inclusive in the sense that it creates broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities. Remember, I'm kind of emphasizing the same rules were open to everyone to come, file a patent. The state enforces your intellectual property rights. So the critical thing lying behind innovation, lying behind economic growth, are what our research shows is these inclusive economic institutions that create broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities. Okay? So what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that we call in our work extractive economic institutions. I'm not going to dwell on that today, but extractive economic institutions are sort of the opposite. They create incentives and opportunities for some people, but not for the broad mass of people. That may make some people very wealthy, but it creates poverty much more broadly. That's the problem in North Korea, and that's why North Korea is poor. Okay. Just to say one thing about the politics, that transition that I showed you, that transition towards innovation, that transition towards patenting, coincides with the transition towards a much more open political society in South Korea. So this is the transition to democracy that took place in South Korea starting in the 1980s. It's true, of course, if I went back to the 1960s and 1970s during the government of Park Chung-hee, there was a lot of emphasis on exporting, on industrialization, on economic growth. But the real explosion of the Korean economy comes after the Park Chung-hee period, although I'm happy to talk about that. It's a fascinating episode. So just to sort of connect the dots here, the political transition, the move towards political inclusion here in terms of democratization in South Korea is what's driving, in our view, in our research, this transition towards economic inclusion and innovation and economic growth in South Korea. Okay, so the second half of my talk, I wanted to see the time. I'm worried I'm going to run out of time here, but someone's going to come and drag me off stage. You know what professors are like. I want to pose the question, or the committee that invited me today, posed the question to me, okay, talk about South Korea. We'd like to hear about South Korea. Why has South Korea been successful? But the audience is going to want to hear about the future. What about the future? Where South Korea did that, okay? And South Korea is amazing, and okay, great. Where else is going to do that? Where could you expect that to happen? Now, my expertise is actually, in the developing world. I've spent the last 30 years working in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. So what I thought I'd persuade you in the rest of my talk is that if you really want to think about where economic growth is going to come from, in the next 50 years, you've got to start thinking about sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm going to say something kind of provocative and outrageous. I'm happy to engage more on this topic. As I say, it's very passionate. It's a great passion of me, for me, and it's a lot of all of my work. So what other parts of the world might follow the path of South Korea? And I don't know about building more inclusive institutions, but experience rapid economic growth, okay? And I think here's a fact that you have to think about, which is the demographics. I don't really think much about demographics, but I think the demographics here are so astonishing that you have to think about it. If you think about the world projection of the United Nations of population movements, by the year 2100, 40% of the people in the world are going to be Africans. Okay? Nigeria is going to overtake the United States as the third most populous country of the world in about 20 years' time. And 40% of the world are going to be Africans. The population of China, according to these UN projections, shrinks by 50%. It's absolutely extraordinary. Europe, not so bad, about 20% the population shrinks. So Africa, 40% of the world are Africans. So can you imagine the world economy with 40% of the people in the entire world impoverished and excluded from modern technology and opportunities? And it can't happen. It can't happen. Okay? You see world population levels off. Okay? So what about Africa? You know, do we expect in Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of Congo the same thing that happened in South Korea? Building inclusive institutions, building state institutions, I don't think so. I think we've had 70 years where it's been very difficult. We've seen it's been very difficult to build the same type of inclusive institutions that were built in East Asia, particularly state institutions. It's very difficult to build those sorts of institutions in Africa. But I think there's different models of economic growth, okay? And there's different ways we can think about this problem, and there's different ways we can think of the world taking advantage of all that potential in Africa. Think about it from the perspective I tried to lay out here. The big thing in Africa is there's millions and billions of people, there's all that talent and energy unutilized, okay? When the world starts utilizing that, that is going to create so much prosperity, it's going to lead to decades of economic growth in the same way that utilizing all that talent, you know, and energy in East Asia has created all this economic growth in the last 70 years, okay? So here's a provocative way of thinking about how that's going to happen, okay? The population of Europe is shrinking. There's a lot of debt. Who's going to pay the debt off? The slide on the right is a sort of beautiful slide that Jita Gopinath, who's the chief economist at the IMF, a former colleague of mine at Harvard, has about, like, there's a debt problem in Europe, but everyone's in denial, meaning this diagram on the right is just sort of showing you that whether you're on the left or the right, the fiscal discourse is moving towards more expansionism. So there's a debt problem, but everyone's in denial and everyone is promising more expenditure and lower taxes, okay? So how do you solve this debt problem? How do you solve the problem of the sustainability of pension system with working age population falling, with population falling? Well, you utilize the Africans, okay? So we need the Africans in Europe. We need young Africans to come and solve our debt problem, to generate income. We need we bring them to the technology and the capital, okay? And one thing that I find very interesting about this model is, you know, the Africans are there. We need the Africans to come. And you could sort of say, well, hold on a second, we're in the world of AI and robots, and there's going to be all this substitution of machines for people, and so why do we really need them? Well, you know, what my experience of working in Africa is, you know, Africans have exactly the skill set that is not going to be replaced by machines and robots. Meaning, you know, the way I think about African society is it's based on incredibly dense social connections and social relations. You know, the way that scholars talk about this is wealth in people. African society is based on wealth in people. People measure their wealth through their social connections and their people. Okay? So Africans have the most amazing people skills, but that's exactly the kind of job that's not going to be replaced by AI. Jobs that are very personal intensive, service jobs, nurses, whatever, That's, so they're not just Africans, we need them, but they have the right sort of skills to help us, okay? Now, you might think this model of we can't solve the institutional problems in Africa, the Africans are this huge resource. How do we take advantage of them? We bring them to us. We have the capital, we have the institutions, we have the expertise. How on earth is that going to work? If you think about history, there's many models like that. What was the model of the United States? The model of the United States was we developed the United States by bringing millions and millions of people to the United States. Now, of course, that only worked because you could expropriate the indigenous people who were there already. So that's not going to work in modern Europe. You need to find a way of integrating, a way of relating to them, a way of bringing them into society. Okay? Now, that sounds completely unrealistic with the modern nation-state model that you have, but Africans never embraced the idea of a nation-state anyway, so that doesn't faze them. Okay? Africans have many identities. They have different identities, they have ethnic identities, they have clan identities, they have national identities, they have global identities, so they don't think like that anyway. Now, Europeans may think like that, but if you start thinking about it, okay, the US model, all right, that's not going to work. But there are other models, okay? And here's the model, a realistic model you might have in mind. How is it that, I'm expecting someone to wave at me, but they're not. You can wave at me if you like. How is it that the Gulf economies have flourished so well, okay? By exactly leveraging their resources with people brought from elsewhere in the world. I think there's lots of limitations in this model, actually. So I'm not really advocating this as the model. I'm just saying it is a model which has allowed the Gulf countries to flourish in a historically unique way. This is just the composition of the population in different parts of the this is just different parts. The orange, think of the orange as being the proportion of the population in different parts of the Gulf that are expats. Okay, so in the UAE, less than 10% of the population are actually Emirati citizens. So these economies have been driven exactly by attracting people from the rest of the world. Okay, I don't think that model is so great in the sense that I think they underestimate the potential in those people when they bring those people into the societies. I think you need a model that can allow all that potential. What's that, 1 minute? Or -1? 1 minute. Okay. It's hard to put a minus sign in front of a finger, I think there's limitations in this model, but I think it's an interesting example of we have the technology, we have the resources, we have the institutions, or we can build the institutions. We don't have people. Where do the people come from? The people come from India, from Kerala, from Malaysia, and that's created this amazing success story, okay? So it's not completely pie in the sky. I put this, I can't go backwards. Oh no, I can. I put this thing, this thing about the Overton window, which is this sort of concept of there are all these conventions about what we can do and what we can't do, And I think in this case, we need some out-of-the-box thinking, or maybe out of the Overton window thinking, which is, we have these big problems, okay? We have our head in the sand. It seems to me, speaking as a European, British, we have our head in the sand on a lot of these problems, I'm putting a positive spin on this. For me, working in Africa, just the amount of wasted talent is just so awful. It's just awful. How can we leverage that? That's going to be good for everybody, not just for the Africans. It's going to be good for us in the same way that East Asian growth was good for everybody, not just for the East Asians. It generated wealth for everybody. There's just this huge untapped resource. How do we take advantage of that? For 70 years, we've been trying to improve the institutions in Africa. We've been doing aid. There's some marginal improvements. But we don't have a recipe for doing that. We don't have a recipe for creating good governance in Nigeria and Congo. Could we try something else to generate an African model of economic growth? And think about the private sector opportunities that would result from that. Okay. Thank you.